We're back with session 28 of Richard Burdick's Numismatic interview. And we previously talked about your friend Andy and slamming specimen high reliefs on the table we're sitting in front of. What other interesting stories do you have about Andy?
Well, first of all, Andy never would have slammed that $20 gold piece if he thought it was genuine. He thought it was a counterfeit, and he never would have abused a good coin, but he thought he'd been taken advantage of. He was mad about it, never got over it, and that's why he acted the way he did. I was very shocked that he did that. But over the years, I think I already talked about the 1811 $5 gold piece, but another piece, very important, was the 1803 over two $5 gold pieces. These pieces were absolutely spectacular pieces, and they're probably the two best coins to come out of his collection. They both ended up in PCGS 66 holders, and they both were in the Pogue collection of $5 gold pieces. That's how spectacular they were. What a great place for him to go, end up in a collection like that.
Wow.
So there was as Andy, I know him over 30 years. He was probably the best mentor I ever had, which it changed my life just knowing this guy. For 30 years, he kept slowly feeding me coins, and a lot of them were really great coins. But he ran out. He started collecting U.S. coins in 1926. He quit collecting them in 1959 because he thought they got too expensive. And he started collecting English coins. In fact, he went to England 5 or 6 times, and he would rent a car, have a driver just drive him all over London to the coin shops. They'd go out to other cities outside of London, going to coin shops. He was really serious collecting English coins, and he couldn't find that many in this country. So he went to their point of origin in England. And after we'd sold the U.S. stuff, he started giving me boxes of his English coins. There was 22 boxes, of the long boxes, not these little short ones. And the coins began, they were struck in England by the Romans during the Roman occupation. I guess the Romans were in several hundred years they were in England. They had traveling mints that would go with the army so they could pay their soldiers as they went. And he collected these because they were actually struck in England, and they were part of a series of English coins. But he had a good eye for quality. And the English market was very weak in the early 1990s. These things were not that easy to sell because there wasn't that many people collecting them. Much difference today. It took me several years to sell, probably 4 or 5 years, to sell those 22 boxes. I had to sell one box at a time. I couldn't break them up. He'd give me a price for the whole box, and it makes it difficult to sell something. These weren't cheap prices because he knew he had very good quality stuff. But like I say, it wasn't that popular in the 1990s. So Andy gave me some really nice proof gold pieces. Basically, I think he had kept a denominational type set. Ones, 2.5s, 5s, 3s. He had one 1904 20 that was, today would slap probably 65. 10 lib would probably slap 64. But overall, his quality was very, very nice. Going back to that $20 proof gold piece, it was an original coin that had never been dipped. You could just tell that it just had its original skin, what we call today. He had a number of phenomenal coins. Beautifully toned gem quality coins.
Well, whatever happened to Andy?
Well,
obviously he's not still around. He'd be 100 and some years old.
We were close friends after 30 years. And we kept in contact. We'd meet once in a while, have dinner, usually in Jackson, Michigan, halfway between his place and mine. And I didn't hear from him for a while. Several months went by. He never had an answering machine. And I finally got a phone call. I hadn't heard from him in 6 or 7 months, I think. And I thought maybe he passed away because I called, nobody ever answered the phone. And finally, he called me. And he'd had a stroke, I think. He'd been in a hospital for several months. and he wanted me to come see him. I drove over and saw him, and I saw him once after that, maybe 6 or 8 months after the hospital incident. And he told me that I went to his house, and he showed me a valise. In the valise were a couple of boxes of coins, which contained modern British coins. They weren't worth a lot of money. I thought they were worth about $4,000. So as time went by, I didn't hear from him for quite some time. His sister called me and told me he'd passed away and wanted to know if I knew about any other coins. And I said, well, did you find the ones in the closet? And she said, well, that door's locked. I said, well, they're in there on the top shelf in a brown valise. So her husband pried the door open with a screwdriver and got out the valise, opened it up, and there they were. I went over and picked them up. I think I sold for maybe $3,600. Wasn't that much, but that was the end of Andy's coins and end of my experiences with him.
Wow, what a story. Let's talk about one of your other mentors. Can we do that?
John Pittman.
Okay.
John Pittman, I met at downtown Detroit at the Cadillac Sheraton Hotel. I'm trying to think what year it was. Probably very, very early, about 1970, I would think. And I had been admiring in the exhibit area. There was a one case that had original proof sets from the 1840s. Now, I had never seen. These were in the original boxes that were issued from the Philadelphia Mint. These things are so rare, even to this day, you hardly ever see one of those unless it's from the Pittman collection. He had an 1843, 1844, 1846, and maybe an 1848 proof sets of all United States coins, copper, half cent, large cent, through the gold pieces. These things were absolutely spectacular. I saw them on exhibit, and of course I didn't know who owned it, but at the end of the show, I had an exhibit there myself of my early U.S. proof sets, but he had the gold coins. And I saw him taking the exhibit down, so I went over and kind of introduced myself to him. And him and I had something in common. We both were very interested in American proof coins, the early ones. And we started talking to each other. And at shows over the years, he would bring things to show me. And he taught me quite a bit. He was one of him, Andy, and Lester Merker were all three of my best mentors. And I think it was the 1991 A&A. John was getting on in age and his health was failing. But he came to me at the show and he says, I brought something to show you. He had a double row box of coins. So we went off in the exhibit area where nobody would bother us. We got a couple of chairs and we sat down. And he took the top off this box and just kind of handed it at me. And I was shocked that John Pittman would show me that this box was full of his early proof coins. There were proof gold pieces in there from the 1830s, quarter eagles and fives. I mean, these are unbelievable, spectacular coins. He's letting me, he trusted me to handle this because he knew that I would be extremely careful. And John had a rule, you could not talk while you had one of his coins out. If you talked when one of his coins were out on a pad or you're handling it, he would put them away and never show you another coin. But those were the rules, and I knew that after knowing him over the years. So he gave me that box and we started looking at it, and the first thing I knew, his head was down on the glass exhibit case and he'd kind of fallen asleep. So I continued going through there, and he finally woke up. I mean, he was asleep at least 5 or 7 minutes, and he said, where were we? And I said, well, we were back here. So I wanted to talk to him about this. I didn't expect him to go to sleep. But that was one of the unique things that happened over the years. And there was Lester Merker, like I said, he was one of my prime mentors.
Right, we talked about the King of Siam proof set with him.
Later on, though, I think it was 1989, 88, Andy had given me a $17.99 $10 gold piece that was just spectacular. And I got it, I think it was 1988. And of course, Andy never had his coin slabbed, and I had very few of my coins slabbed. I was so impressed with that coin. I just bought it from Andy.
Is that the one that ended up in the 66 holder?
Let me. I'll get to that part. So I had no. I did have that coin slabbed. JD, who was one of the principals, John Danver, one of the principals of PCGS, called me up one day, and he says, he said, I know you've got some really nice things put away. Why don't you bring them to the Atlanta ANA and I'll look at them and maybe we'll get them slabbed. I said, fine. So I showed him, I think, a dozen coins, and there was only 4 or 5 that we agreed on the grade, and one of them was the 1799-10. And I told JD, I said, now if this comes back in anything less than a 65 holder, I don't want it in a holder. So it comes back. JD can't control what it grades, but him and I, the ones that we agreed on the grade, that's the ones I let him put into PCGS. So it came back in a 64 holder. And I said, I told Jay, he said, I know, he says, but it's much more valuable in that holder. He says, that's the first one we've ever graded 64. He said, just leave it in that holder. When you go to sell, it'd be worth more. So probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 months later, I showed it around at shows. And a guy called me, he was at a show in Florida, and he called me up and he says, I really want to buy that 1799-10. I said, well, it's really not for sale. He says, well, I'll give you $70,000 for it. And I said, okay. I sold it to him. I think I paid $18,000 for it, but that was a strong price in the early 80s when I got it from Andy. But not long after I slabbed that coin as a 64, another one got slabbed by Mike Brownlee in Dallas, Texas. So then there were 2 in 64 holders for a long time. And then several years later, actually it was, it must have been 2006 or 7, I was visiting Brent Pogue in Newport Beach, California, and he brought some. I would often visit him and talk to him about coins out of the collection. And here's the $17.99 $10 gold piece that I'd owned for several years, and often regretted selling. And it's in a PCGS 66 holder. And that coin in their auction, I think, brought around $350,000. Wow. So it was kind of a hard pill to swallow once, but many, many years went by. And that's what can happen to the price of coins. Really good coins.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about a couple other big name people that most people these days only know them from possibly reading an article or seeing an old paper or old magazine. What about like Amon Carter?
Oh, I was at the 1969 ANA in Philadelphia, and I'd already met Mike Brownlee, who I think I just mentioned. We talked for maybe 30 minutes at a show. To talk to somebody that long at an ANA, for a dealer to take that much time out, was very unusual. So a couple hours later, I'm walking by his table again. He came around. He says, "There's somebody I'd like you to meet." So this guy comes out there, and Mike Brownlee says, "Richard, this is Amon Carter." I had no idea who Amon Carter was. But Amon was a real collector. And he come around, I'd seen this case at Mike Brown. There's hundreds of $50 slugs all piled up in this case. So Amon had me come around, he opened the case, he says, "Reach in there and get you some." So I picked one out. And he says, no. He went like this, and just, I don't know, he just took a double handful and put them on the case. Next, we closed the case, and I said, "Get you some." So he telling me about octagonal $50 slugs. So I saw him, and we never got to be close friends, but I'd see him at shows periodically, and he's always a down-to-earth guy, an extremely wealthy man, but if you like coins, he liked you, so to speak. And I went to his auction at Stack's 1984. And I was looking at the coins, and I'd heard about this coin, but never. Here it is in my hand, this incredible 1794 silver dollar. And I just thought, there's no way I can afford a coin like that. I had never seen an early U.S. silver coin like this one. A 1794 dollar in gem condition. I didn't know that thing existed, but I'd never forgotten. I floated off the chair when I had that coin in my hand. And years later, I mean, they would float around the coin market. And many years later, I think it was 2013, in the Cardinal collection, that coin was hammered down at just over $10 million. To think back in 1984, I'd seen, I think, about $180,000, which was a lot of money at that time. And actually, I knew the guy who bought that at the Amon Carter collection auction. I think it was actually purchased, I think, by Eddie Milas. And he bought it for another famous collector from Fort Worth, Texas. Marvin Browder was his name. Now, Marvin and I became very good friends. And Marvin and I would often go out to dinner, both here and at auctions in Switzerland. But Marvin and I went out to dinner, and he wasn't acting his normal jovial self. And I said, Marvin, what's wrong? And he told me, he says, Eddie told me I've got to sell my $1794. And I said, well, you don't have to sell it. He said, well, I made an agreement with Eddie that Eddie would tell me when to buy the coins and when to sell the coins. And he said, Eddie yesterday said, it's time to sell your coin. So the next day, I saw the coin in Eddie's case. His coin company's name was Rakoa. I was walking around, and I was talking with, sitting at the table of Andy Lustig. And I said, Andy, do you realize that Amon Carter's $1794 is for sale? And he stood up, walked over there, and bought it. I think the price was $375,000. And he did that. I mean, I told him about it, and he just stood up and went over and bought the coin. I was amazed. It's true.
Wow.
And like I say, years later, other people owned it in between. I think Jay Perino from Kansas City, I believe he owned that coin at one time. And it went to Steve Contursi owned it. I think he sold it to Martin Loeys, who was the main principal in the Cardinal collection. So I've watched that coin go through the market for many years.
My wife and I saw that coin. We were flying to visit her family in Poland, and we had a 8-hour layover in Poland in Warsaw, and so we went downtown to try to look at the city museum. Unfortunately, it was on a Monday. It was closed, but they told us that the Money Museum was open, and we were allowed to go over there. And there they had an original copy of the U.S. Constitution, as well as the specimen 66 1794 silver dollar.
You'd run into that.
I ran into it in Poland, and they didn't laugh when I pulled out my magnifying glass and asked if I could put a loop on it again. They didn't find that humorous.
They didn't want you to pick it up out of the case, I'm sure.
Yeah,
everything was probably armed guards watching you.
Yes, but it was quite interesting to run into that coin halfway around the world.
I've known or met. I was in a stacks auction one time, and I bid on an Indian penny. It was beautifully toned Indian penny. And this guy sitting next to me, some old man, I didn't know who he was. He introduced himself. And his name was Charles J. Stacks sold most of his coins in the fairly early 60s, I think, or 1967, I think, was they sold most of his coins. But because I'd bought this Indian penny, it was from his collection. And he made comment, and like I say, he introduced himself to me, and I never met him afterwards, but that's another one of the famous people that I met over the years.
Well, let's go ahead and take a little.
There's others.
Yeah, let's take a little break now. We'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more, reminisce about some of the other power people in this business that you've met. And once again, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe, or leave a comment in the section below. Thank you.